The German soldiers who survived the winter of 1942 to 1943 in the ruined city on the Volga River had a name for their predicament: der Kessel, the Cauldron. It was a term that perfectly captured the hellish encirclement, the suffocating pressure, and the slow, agonizing death of an entire army trapped within a noose of Soviet steel. The Battle of Stalingrad, which raged from August 23, 1942, to February 2, 1943, stands as one of the most significant military engagements in human history, not merely because of its staggering scale or its decisive impact on the Second World War, but because it represented the collision of two totalitarian ideologies at their most extreme. The transformation of modern industrial warfare into brutal close-quarters struggle, and the psychological breaking point of Nazi Germany's seemingly invincible Wehrmacht. The historical thesis is stark. Stalingrad was the fulcrum upon which the Eastern Front tilted permanently towards Soviet victory. Before Stalingrad, German forces had advanced thousands of kilometers into Soviet territory, captured millions of prisoners, and seemed poised to break the Soviet Union as a military power. After Stalingrad, the strategic initiative passed irrevocably to the Red Army, beginning a relentless westward advance that would culminate in Berlin's fall. More than any other single battle, Stalingrad demonstrated that the Wehrmacht could be not merely stopped, but systematically destroyed through Soviet numerical superiority, improving tactical competence and willingness to absorb casualties on a scale that would have broken any other military force. The political climate leading to Stalingrad was shaped by Adolf Hitler's fundamental strategic miscalculation regarding the Soviet Union. Following the failure to capture Moscow in winter 1941, Hitler radically restructured German strategic priorities for the 1942 summer offensive. Rather than concentrating forces for a renewed assault on the Soviet capital, he divided his armies in an ambitious two-pronged offensive designated Operation Blue, or Fall Blau. The northern axis would drive towards Stalingrad on the Volga River, while the southern axis would push into the Caucasus to seize oil fields that fueled Soviet military resistance. This division of forces reflected Hitler's increasing obsession with economic objectives over purely military ones. He believed that seizing Soviet oil production while simultaneously severing the Volga transportation route would cripple the Soviet war economy more effectively than capturing Moscow. Joseph Stalin, meanwhile, had learned painful lessons from 1941's catastrophic defeats. The Soviet dictator had gradually, reluctantly begun delegating greater operational authority to professional military commanders, though he remained deeply involved in strategic decisions. The Soviet High Command, or Stavka, under Chief of the General Staff Alexander Vasilevsky and increasingly influential commanders like Georgy Zhukov, had begun developing more sophisticated defensive doctrines emphasizing defense in depth, strategic reserves, and counteroffensive operations rather than the rigid forward defense that had proven so disastrous in 1941. The city that would give its name to this apocalyptic struggle was itself a symbol of Soviet industrial might and Stalinist ambition. Originally named Tsaritsyn, it had been renamed Stalingrad in 1925 to honor Stalin's role in its defense during the Russian Civil War. By 1942, it was a major industrial center stretching nearly 40 kilometers along the western bank of the Volga River, with a population of approximately 600,000 civilians. The city produced tanks, artillery pieces, and ammunition at several major factories, including the massive tractor factory, the Barikady Ordnance Factory, and the Red October steel plant. Beyond its industrial significance, Stalingrad was a critical transportation hub where the Volga River could be interdicted by German forces, potentially severing Soviet supply lines from the Caucasus. The German offensive towards Stalingrad began as part of Operation Blue, launched on June 28, 1942. The forces initially designated for the Stalingrad Axis consisted primarily of General Friedrich Paulus's Sixth Army, which at full strength comprised approximately 270,000 men organized into 13 infantry divisions, 3 motorized divisions, 3 panzer divisions, and 1 anti-aircraft division. The Sixth Army was supported by elements of Hermann Hoth's Fourth Panzer Army and substantial Luftwaffe air assets under Luftflotte 4. By the time battle commenced in earnest in August 1942, German and Axis forces committed to the Stalingrad sector would grow to include substantial Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian contingents deployed to protect the extended flanks, a deployment that would prove catastrophically consequential. The German Sixth Army entered the Stalingrad operation with approximately 100,000 combat infantry troops, supported by roughly 500 tanks, including Panzer III and Panzer IV medium tanks, and possessed approximately 7,000 artillery pieces and mortars across all calibers when at peak strength in September 1942. Soviet forces defending Stalingrad were initially organized under General Vasily Chuikov's 62nd Army as the primary defensive force within the city proper. Chuikov's 62nd Army at the beginning of the defense comprised approximately 54,000 troops and 110 tanks, grossly outnumbered by attacking German forces but continuously reinforced across the Volga River despite heavy casualties. The Luftwaffe committed approximately 1,200 aircraft to support operations in the Stalingrad sector, including Junkers 87 Stuka dive bombers, Heinkel 111 medium bombers, and Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters. This represented one of the largest concentrations of German air power on the Eastern Front, and initially gave Germany complete air superiority. The city of Stalingrad stretched approximately 30 kilometers along the western bank of the Volga River, but was only 2 to 8 kilometers deep, creating an extremely narrow battlefield that negated German advantages in mobile warfare and forced combat into close-quarters urban fighting where Soviet forces proved increasingly effective. By November 1942, when the Soviet counteroffensive launched, the Wehrmacht and its Axis allies had deployed approximately 1,011,500 troops in the Stalingrad sector, opposed by approximately 1,143,500 Soviet troops. The critical disparity existed on the flanks, where Romanian Third and Fourth Armies, equipped with inferior weapons and lacking adequate anti-tank capabilities, protected the extended German penetration. The strategic doctrine that brought German forces to Stalingrad represented both the Wehrmacht's operational brilliance and its increasingly apparent limitations. German planning for Operation Blue demonstrated sophisticated thinking about the relationship between economic warfare and military operations. Hitler and the German High Command correctly identified that Soviet military power ultimately rested on industrial production and resource extraction. The Caucasus oil fields produced approximately 86% of Soviet aviation fuel and represented the primary source of petroleum products for the entire Soviet war machine. Simultaneously, the Volga River served as the primary transportation route for oil, food, and raw materials from southern Soviet Union to industrial centers supporting Soviet armies. However, this strategic vision contained fatal operational flaws. The decision to pursue both Stalingrad and the Caucasus simultaneously divided German forces at the operational level, creating two divergent axes of advance that could not mutually support each other. As the summer offensive progressed, the distance between Army Group A driving toward the Caucasus and Army Group B advancing on Stalingrad grew to hundreds of kilometers, connected only by extended and vulnerable supply lines protected by increasingly threadbare German reserves and unreliable Axis allied forces. The German tactical approach to urban warfare, while initially effective, proved ill-suited to Stalingrad's specific conditions. Wehrmacht doctrine emphasized combined arms coordination, with infantry, armor, artillery, and air power working in synchronized operations. This approach worked devastatingly well in open terrain and initial urban penetration operations. However, once combat devolved into fighting for individual buildings and city blocks, German tactical advantages eroded dramatically. Tanks became vulnerable in narrow streets where Soviet infantry could approach with close-range anti-tank weapons. Artillery and air bombardment, while massively destructive, created rubble that actually enhanced defensive positions. Soviet defensive doctrine at Stalingrad evolved through painful experience into an approach studied by military theorists for decades afterward. Under Vasily Chuikov's command, the 62nd Army developed hugging tactics, maintaining such close proximity to German forces that German artillery and air support could not be employed without risking friendly fire. Soviet infantry would deliberately occupy positions within 30 to 50 meters of German lines, sometimes sharing buildings with German troops occupying different floors. This forced combat into close quarters where Soviet advantages in numbers and willingness to accept casualties offset German advantages in training and equipment quality. The opening phase of the Battle of Stalingrad began with a massive aerial bombardment on August 23, 1942. The Luftwaffe launched one of the most intensive bombing campaigns of the war, with approximately 600 aircraft conducting wave after wave of attacks throughout the day and into the night. The bombing focused initially on military targets, but quickly expanded to terrorize the civilian population. Massive fuel storage tanks along the Volga River front were hit, creating towering columns of flame that illuminated the city throughout the night. Estimates suggest approximately 40,000 civilians died in the opening days of aerial bombardment, with entire residential districts reduced to burning rubble. Simultaneously with the air assault, General Paulus ordered the 14th Panzer Corps to execute a rapid armored thrust to reach the Volga River north of the city center. This bold operational maneuver succeeded beyond initial expectations. By evening, August 23rd, advance elements of the 16th Panzer Division reached the Volga at Rhynok, establishing the first German positions on the river and effectively cutting Stalingrad off from direct land connection to Soviet forces to the north. This penetration, achieved with approximately 200 tanks and motorized infantry, created a narrow corridor, roughly 8 kilometers wide, extending to the Volga. However, this initial success exposed vulnerabilities that would characterize the entire campaign. The German corridor was extremely narrow, with Soviet forces retaining positions on both flanks. Soviet artillery immediately began interdicting the corridor, making it hazardous for German reinforcements and supplies to move forward. More critically, the rapid advance had outpaced German infantry support, leaving the Panzer spearhead isolated and vulnerable to counterattack. The defense of Stalingrad formally became the responsibility of the Soviet 62nd Army under General Vasily Chuikov on September 12, 1942, at a moment when the situation appeared nearly hopeless. German forces had penetrated deep into the city from west and north. Soviet defensive lines were fragmenting, and evacuation across the Volga seemed imminent. Chuikov, a tough, aggressive commander with extensive combat experience, arrived at the 62nd Army headquarters and immediately imposed his tactical philosophy on the defense. He issued orders that every position must be held to the death, that counterattacks must be launched immediately to recapture lost positions, and most importantly, that Soviet troops must maintain such close proximity to German positions that German artillery and air superiority would become irrelevant. The German offensive to capture Stalingrad proper intensified through mid-September 1942, with major assault operations that progressively reduced the Soviet-held portion of the city but never achieved complete victory. The first major assault, launched September 13th to 14th, targeted Mamayev Kurgan, a prominent hill in the city center that provided observation over the entire battlefield. The fighting for Mamayev Kurgan epitomized the character of the entire Stalingrad battle. Intense close-quarters combat for strategically vital terrain, with positions changing hands multiple times within hours, casualties measured in thousands, for gains measured in dozens of meters. German forces employed massive concentrations of combat power for these urban assaults. A typical attack would begin with hours-long artillery bombardments and Stuka dive bomber attacks that reduced buildings to skeletal ruins. Assault groups composed of engineer troops, flamethrower teams, infantry squads, and occasionally tanks would then advance methodically, clearing structures room by room. The Germans perfected techniques for urban warfare, explosively breaching walls rather than using doors, throwing grenades into rooms before entering, using flamethrowers to clear basements and bunkers. Yet, even these sophisticated tactics produced gains measured in city blocks per day rather than the kilometers per hour advances that characterized mobile warfare. Soviet defensive tactics countered German assault methods through cruel experience and constant tactical innovation. Chuikov organized the defense around strong points established in key buildings, particularly large concrete structures like factories and apartment blocks that could withstand bombardment and provide excellent fields of fire. These strong points were garrisoned by platoon or company-sized forces with orders to hold indefinitely, supplied and reinforced through communications trenches and underground passages when surface movement became impossible. The fighting reached particularly savage intensity in the factory district in northern Stalingrad, where three massive industrial complexes, the tractor factory, the Barricade factory, and the Red October steel plant, dominated the narrow strip of land between the Volga and German positions. These factories, even while being fought over, continued producing weapons and ammunition used immediately in the defense. Workers would finish assembling tanks that would drive directly from the factory floor into combat. The factories themselves provided natural fortresses, with reinforced concrete walls, machinery creating natural obstacles, and complex layouts favoring defenders who knew the terrain intimately. The German attempt to capture the factory district in October 1942 represented the high watermark of Wehrmacht offensive capability at Stalingrad. Paulus committed virtually every available reserve, concentrating approximately 90,000 troops and 300 tanks for massive attacks beginning October 14th. The assault opened with the most intensive artillery bombardment of the entire campaign, with approximately 3,000 German artillery sorties and continuous Luftwaffe attacks throughout the day. German forces achieved significant penetration, capturing portions of the tractor factory and pushing Soviet defenders back toward the Volga at multiple points. The Soviet-held portion contracted to a strip rarely more than 1,000 meters deep from the riverbank, with German positions in some locations within 200 to 300 meters of the Volga itself. The German offensive exhausted itself through sheer attrition by early November 1942. Infantry companies that began the battle with 80 to 100 men had been reduced to 20 to 30. Ammunition expenditure far exceeded supply capabilities. Tanks and vehicles broke down at rates exceeding maintenance units' ability to repair them. German soldiers, who had endured continuous combat since June through summer heat and increasingly cold autumn weather, were physically and psychologically depleted. Throughout this grinding attrition, Soviet operational planning for a massive counteroffensive proceeded in absolute secrecy. General Georgy Zhukov, now Deputy Supreme Commander, had arrived at the Stalingrad front in September and immediately recognized the opportunity that German operational dispositions created. The narrow German penetration to Stalingrad meant that extended, vulnerable flanks protected by Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian armies stretched hundreds of kilometers north and south of the city. These Axis Allied forces, while numerous on paper, were equipped with inferior weapons, lacked adequate anti-tank capabilities, possessed weak artillery support, and had uncertain morale. Zhukov, working with Chief of the General Staff Alexander Vasilevsky and the Stavka planning staff, developed Operation Uranus, a double envelopment designed to cut off and encircle the entire German force at Stalingrad through simultaneous breakthroughs against the Romanian armies north and south of the city. The operational concept was classically simple: concentrate overwhelming force at breakthrough points, punch through weak Axis positions with massed armor and infantry, then rapidly drive mobile exploitation forces deep into the German rear to meet and close the encirclement ring far enough west to trap the Sixth Army before it could withdraw. Soviet deception measures for Operation Uranus proved extraordinarily effective. Troop movements occurred exclusively at night, with strict radio silence and false radio traffic maintaining the impression that units remained in original positions. Tank formations were held in reserve far enough back that engine noise would not alert German forward positions. Artillery was pre-positioned in camouflaged firing positions and would not register fire until the opening barrage. German intelligence, despite hints that Soviet forces were preparing a major operation, fundamentally misread Soviet capabilities and intentions. The Soviet force assembled for Operation Uranus represented one of the largest operational-level concentrations of the war. The Southwestern Front, under General Nikolai Vatutin, concentrated approximately 398,000 troops, 900 tanks, and 13,500 artillery pieces. The Stalingrad Front, under General Andrei Yeremenko, assembled approximately 429,000 troops, 740 tanks, and 10,300 artillery pieces. Total Soviet forces involved exceeded 1.1 million personnel. Operation Uranus commenced in darkness and fog on the morning of November the 19th, 1942, with a massive artillery bombardment that announced to German and Romanian forces that their strategic situation had fundamentally changed. At 0730 hours Moscow time, approximately 3,500 Soviet artillery pieces and multiple rocket launchers opened fire simultaneously along breakthrough sectors north of Stalingrad, targeting Romanian defensive positions held by the 3rd Romanian Army. The bombardment lasted 80 minutes, systematically destroying Romanian defensive works, cutting communication lines, suppressing artillery batteries, and shattering unit coherence. Soviet breakthrough forces advanced into Romanian positions behind the rolling artillery barrage, with overwhelming concentration of combat power. The primary Soviet exploitation forces, the 1st Tank Corps, 26th Tank Corps, and 4th Tank Corps, represented approximately 500 tanks supported by mechanized infantry and mobile artillery. Romanian anti-tank guns, predominantly 37mm pieces inadequate against even light Soviet tanks, had minimal effect. By the end of the first day, Soviet forces had achieved breakthrough penetrations of 20 to 30 kilometers, completely rupturing the Romanian defensive front and creating expanding gaps through which exploitation forces poured. The southern pincer of Operation Uranus struck on November the 20th, 1942, following the same operational pattern against the 4th Romanian Army south of Stalingrad. Again, massive artillery preparation destroyed defensive positions before Soviet armor and mechanized forces drove through Romanian lines. The southern breakthrough achieved even greater success, with Soviet forces advancing more than 50 kilometers on the first day against minimal resistance. The Romanian Fourth Army effectively disintegrated as a cohesive military force. The two Soviet pincers drove toward each other with remarkable speed and coordination, converging on the town of Kalak on the Don River, approximately 100 kilometers west of Stalingrad. On November 23, 1942, forward elements of the 26th Tank Corps from the Northern Pincer and the 4th Mechanized Corps from the Southern Pincer met at Kalak, completing the encirclement of the German 6th Army, most of the 4th Panzer Army, and remnants of 2 Romanian divisions. Approximately 290,000 Axis troops were now trapped within what the Soviets designated the Stalingrad Kessel. General Friedrich Paulus, commanding the now encircled 6th Army, immediately recognized the desperate nature of his situation and requested permission from Hitler to attempt a breakout to the southwest while Soviet encirclement forces were still relatively thin. However, Hitler categorically refused to authorize withdrawal, instead ordering Paulus to establish hedgehog defensive positions and hold Stalingrad, while relief forces organized a counteroffensive to break through the encirclement from outside. Hitler's refusal to authorize breakout rested on multiple miscalculations. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring assured Hitler that air supply could sustain the 6th Army within the encirclement, citing successful aerial resupply of encircled German forces at Demyansk earlier in 1942. This assurance proved catastrophically wrong. The 6th Army required approximately 700 tons of supplies daily to maintain combat effectiveness. The Luftwaffe air transport fleet possessed neither the aircraft numbers nor operational capability to deliver such quantities. Actual daily deliveries averaged approximately 100 tons, occasionally reaching 200 tons on exceptional days, but never approaching requirements. The supply situation within the Kessel deteriorated rapidly through late November and December 1942. German troops faced temperatures dropping to minus 30 degrees Celsius without proper clothing, heating fuel, or shelter. Food rations were systematically reduced, from full rations in late November to half rations in December, and eventually to starvation rations of 200 to 300 grams of bread daily, supplemented by horse meat from thousands of draft animals slaughtered as fodder ran out. Ammunition was strictly rationed. Medical supplies, including anesthetics and antibiotics, vanished entirely. The German relief operation, designated Operation Winter Storm, launched on December 12, 1942, under Field Marshal Erich von Manstein's command. Manstein assembled the 4th Panzer Army under General Hermann Hoth, incorporating the 6th Panzer Division, 23rd Panzer Division, and 17th Panzer Division, approximately 230 tanks representing substantial German armor concentration. By December 19th, German forces had reached the Miscalculation River, barely 48 kilometers from the Stalingrad pocket. At this critical moment, Paulus faced the decision whether to disobey Hitler's orders and launch a breakout operation. However, Paulus, a professionally competent but personally cautious commander who adhered rigidly to military discipline, refused to act without explicit authorization from Hitler, authorization that never came. The strategic opportunity for German breakout vanished on December 24, 1942, when Soviet forces launched Operation Little Saturn, a major offensive targeting Italian and Romanian forces northwest of the Stalingrad encirclement. This operation threatened to encircle Manstein's entire army group, Don. Manstein was forced to withdraw the 4th Panzer Army from its position on the Miscalculation River, ending any possibility of relief for Stalingrad. From December 25th onward, the 6th Army's fate was sealed. The Soviet reduction of the Stalingrad pocket proceeded with methodical brutality through January 1943. On January 8, 1943, Soviet commanders issued an ultimatum to Paulus offering honorable surrender terms. Paulus forwarded the offer to Hitler, who again refused, forbidding surrender and promoting Paulus to field marshal, a gesture laden with symbolic pressure, as no German field marshal had ever surrendered. The final Soviet offensive to liquidate the pocket, Operation Ring, began on January 10, 1943, with overwhelming force. Soviet artillery, now including heavy siege guns, systematically destroyed German defensive works. The German perimeter contracted steadily, with surviving troops retreating into the rubble of central Stalingrad. On January 31st, 1943, Field Marshal Paulus surrendered to Soviet forces in the basement of the Wehrmacht department store. The last organized German resistance ceased on February 2nd, 1943. Approximately 91,000 German and Axis soldiers entered Soviet captivity, the ragged survivors of an army that had numbered nearly 300,000 at the time of encirclement. These prisoners, many already critically weakened by starvation and disease, faced brutal conditions in Soviet prison camps. Fewer than 6,000 would survive captivity to return to Germany over the subsequent decade. The immediate cost of the Battle of Stalingrad remains subject to historical debate, but modern scholarly consensus provides sobering numbers. Soviet military casualties, killed, missing, wounded, and captured, totaled approximately 1.1 million soldiers across all operations associated with Stalingrad. German and Axis military casualties approached 850,000, including the entire 6th Army destroyed within the encirclement, plus catastrophic losses among Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian forces. The destruction of the German 6th Army represented the loss of an entire field army comprising some of the Wehrmacht's most experienced divisions and irreplaceable combat veterans. Material losses included approximately 900 aircraft, 1,500 tanks, and 6,000 artillery pieces for Germany, losses that could not be quickly replaced given Germany's deteriorating strategic position. The Battle of Stalingrad permanently reshaped the strategic trajectory of the Second World War and established psychological and material conditions that made ultimate Allied victory inevitable. Most immediately, Stalingrad destroyed German offensive capability on the Eastern Front. The loss of the Sixth Army, combined with catastrophic casualties among other German and Axis forces in the southern Soviet Union, meant that Germany could never again mount the kind of large-scale, multi-front offensive operations that had characterized 1941 and 1942. The Wehrmacht would launch one more major offensive, Operation Citadel at Kursk in July 1943. But this represented a localized attack rather than a theater-wide campaign, and its failure confirmed that strategic initiative had passed permanently to the Soviet Union. Stalingrad's impact extended far beyond the immediate military balance. The battle demonstrated to the world, including Germany's allies and potential adversaries, that the Wehrmacht was not invincible. This psychological shift had profound strategic consequences. Neutral nations reconsidered their positions. Turkey, which had been contemplating entering the war on Germany's side, remained neutral. Japan, which had been considering attacking the Soviet Union from the east, definitively abandoned such plans and focused on its deteriorating position in the Pacific. Germany's European allies, Romania, Hungary, Italy, began seeking ways to exit the war or minimize their commitments, recognizing that Germany's ultimate defeat was increasingly probable. For the Soviet Union, Stalingrad represented both vindication and transformation. Stalin's leadership, which had been catastrophically inadequate in 1941, had evolved to allow greater professional military autonomy. The victory at Stalingrad, achieved through sophisticated operational planning, effective deception, and coordinated multi-front operations, demonstrated that the Red Army had matured into a formidable military instrument capable of executing complex offensive operations. This capability would be refined and employed repeatedly over the next 2 years in a series of devastating offensives that systematically expelled German forces from Soviet territory and carried the Red Army westward into Eastern Europe and ultimately Germany itself. The specific lesson that military strategists drew from Stalingrad concerned the dangers of operational overextension and the critical importance of protecting flanks and lines of communication. The German advance to Stalingrad had created a narrow, deep penetration supported by extended supply lines and protected by unreliable Allied forces, a classic operational configuration vulnerable to double envelopment. Soviet planners had recognized this vulnerability and exploited it brilliantly. Future military operations would demonstrate heightened awareness of these risks, though the fundamental tension between the offensive desire to advance rapidly and the defensive requirement to maintain secure flanks and communications remained an enduring challenge of operational art. Modern historiography of Stalingrad has evolved through several distinct phases. Immediately following the war, Soviet historiography emphasized the battle as evidence of communist system superiority and Stalin's genius as a military leader, systematically downplaying the catastrophic errors that had made the German advance possible and overstating Stalin's positive contributions to the victory. German accounts, particularly memoirs published by surviving generals, tended to blame Hitler's interference for the disaster while minimizing Wehrmacht culpability for the broader criminal nature of the war in the East. More recent scholarship, benefiting from access to Soviet archives following the Cold War's end, has produced more nuanced understanding. Historians now recognize that Stalingrad's outcome resulted from complex interaction of factors: German strategic overreach and Hitler's increasingly irrational operational interference, Soviet improvements in operational planning and execution, the Red Army's ability to absorb casualties and regenerate combat power at rates that exceeded German capacity to inflict losses, and the particular characteristics of urban warfare that negated many German tactical advantages. Contemporary historians also emphasize the horrific human cost of the battle. particularly the systematic starvation of the encircled German army and the brutal treatment of prisoners, while also documenting the immense suffering imposed on Soviet soldiers and civilians throughout the campaign. Recent discoveries and archival research continue to refine understanding of specific aspects of the battle. Detailed analysis of German logistics has confirmed that the Luftwaffe could never have sustained the encircled Sixth Army regardless of operational conditions, making Hitler's decision to forbid breakout essentially a death sentence for the army. Research into Soviet operational planning has revealed the sophisticated deception measures and the extent to which Soviet commanders had learned from earlier failures. Studies of the battle's aftermath have documented the fate of prisoners and the long-term demographic and economic impact on both Germany and the Soviet Union. The enduring significance of Stalingrad lies not merely in its immediate military consequences, but in what it revealed about the nature of total war between industrialized totalitarian states. The battle demonstrated that modern warfare had evolved to a scale and intensity where entire armies could be consumed in single operations, where civilian populations would be systematically destroyed as collateral damage or deliberate targets, and where political ideologies would drive military decisions even when those decisions guaranteed catastrophic losses. Stalingrad stands as perhaps the clearest example in military history of war prosecuted without restraint, without mercy, and without regard for human cost. A cautionary lesson that remains grimly relevant in understanding the potential consequences of great power conflict in the modern era.